Now, before I talk about the shortcomings and the current concerns about public blockchains, let me compare the biggest networks that exist so far. The most widely known one is, of course, Bitcoin. We've talked about this extensively already. As you may recall, this is the first application of a working public permissionless blockchain that allows value transfer. So essentially, it was the first solution to the double spending problem of the exchange of digital assets. And the main innovation was that it combines the proof of work protocol for consensus with public-private key cryptography and the storing of information in blocks. So it's really these three components together that make the blockchain work. Now, it's very important to emphasize Bitcoin is not a firm. It's not controlled by any single entity. Yes, there is some standard software that all parties employ, but there is no single person that forces compliance to standards. Everything is open source. Changes to the protocol and the general behavior require consensus. So either a vast majority of users of the blockchain, and particularly of the miners, follows the protocol or not. And if they don't, then there's no change. But the really big problem with Bitcoin is essentially what it is really is just a transfer of stickers. I mean, it could be valuable stickers and non-valuable stickers, but really just you can only transfer Bitcoins and that's it. Now, Ethereum is based on the idea and tries to be an improvement of blockchain. So since Bitcoin essentially is just single use to transfer coins, Ethereum tries to be more. Ethereum essentially actually stems from a development that people worked on in Bitcoin, which was that they wanted to initiate the trading of so-called colored coins. The idea being that you take a Bitcoin and you basically paint it a different color and call it something else. So, for instance, there is a trading venue in the UK/Switzerland. It's called Lique, and they were the first to actually among the first to issue a colored coin as essentially what amounts to a share of their firm using the Bitcoin blockchain. Right. Now, Ethereum should be thought of as blockchain 2.0. It does have a cryptocurrency, but the cryptocurrency Ether is really more of a means to an end. It is not the essential part of this network. So just to give you an example and give you an idea of what this is about, how do you arrange actually a true exchange that happens only on the blockchain? So Bitcoin is an exchange of coin for coin. It makes actually very little sense that I send you coins and somebody else sends me coins. Normally you send something else in return. So in order to arrange an exchange properly, you need some form of escrow. And an escrow on a blockchain should just be a contract, if you want, where you put the money into the escrow account, into the escrow contract, and once a certain condition is met, the money is being released. And that, in a nutshell, is one of the things that Ethereum does extremely well. So if you apply this a little broader, what you create is a virtual computer technology. And it allows then decentralized code execution. Now, I want to be very clear that this does not mean that Ethereum is a supercomputer. It is essentially just the opposite, because running computations on the Ethereum blockchain is extremely expensive. Now, what is the issue, though, with code execution? Well, code execution requires programming cycles. It requires computing power. And even though the execution of an escrow account is not particularly cumbersome, your phone can do it in nanoseconds, it still requires computing power. And you can design a code, if you want, with just a few lines of code that would crash any computer. You basically just go into an infinite circle and that's it. You obviously want to avoid something like that happening in a decentralized computing network. So how do you do that? Well, you make people pay for it. So, and this goes back actually to the original idea of coins as they were used, for instance, for payments for emails. When you send billions of spam messages, that is not profitable if you actually have to pay for them. And the same idea is here. So essentially what you do is you have this cryptocurrency and you pay for the GPU cycles that you have to do. So for instance, the transaction uses 21,000 such cycles. So it is measured in Ethereum in gas. Other interactions deploying a smart contracts take about 10 times as much. Now, the big message here is that Ethereum, the Ethereum network in Ether, is not just a better cryptocurrency, it is a code execution network that runs and is being fueled by the cryptocurrency Ether. So here's a little bit of history of the Ethereum network. It was developed and built by Waterloo, so that's in Canada-based team around Vitalik Buterin. It's not a firm. They had the chance to sell their entire system to Google actually in the process, but they declined doing it. And instead, what they did is they founded a foundation that owns a major portion of Ether coins. And by that, what they wanted to ensure is that this is not going to be a for-profit company, but rather that it is something which is public and open for everybody to use. The founders, don't get me wrong, the founders still got pretty wealthy on this one. So in contrast to Bitcoin, which started and with a distribution of coins to, people, to addresses, the Ethereum network actually had a fundraising campaign. At the time, was one of the largest crowdfunding campaigns. I believe they raised about $50 million. And as a little tidbit of information, at the time, they couldn't actually do this fundraising campaign in Canada because no Canadian bank would give them a bank account. As a consequence of which, the Ethereum Foundation moved to Switzerland. And as we know, the Canadian government here did a really great job at protecting people from the evils of Ethereum. Now, with this philosophy, with this history of how it was set up, there comes a certain philosophy. The whole idea is that blockchain entities usually don't strive to be firms. They try to create something which is there for the greater good. And much of the internet followed a different protocol. So we use the HTTP protocol, we use the TCP/IP protocol. Even MP3 was developed at CERN at basically a university and academic environment. Now, the people who work for blockchain-based firms, what they do often is they form teams or projects. They may work on several different projects simultaneously, but usually this is a single interaction engagement. They are usually not particularly concerned about their intellectual property, and instead release their code to the public in common public code sharing facilities. They also don't strive to do all of this to get a high-powered bank at a job or to sell to a large bank, but rather they just want to create some cool codes. And, to some degree, they do want to benefit of it. So this is why they like talking about their Lamborghinis, their Lambos. Now, one thing that has to be talked about is the mining concentration. The entire idea of Bitcoin and Ether or Ethereum is that it is a decentralized network which is controlled by nobody. However, if you look at the mining, so that means the group on the data centers that process the mining, it is very clear that there is a huge degree of concentration for both of these networks. Now, this is not controlled by a single person. Often people just collaborate to be part of a mining network. But the concentration, as you can see, is just gigantic. In Bitcoin, 5 mining pools control about 75% of all hash power. In Ethereum, it is even more extreme. So since miners have a huge say over the changes in the protocol, and since they basically do the governance of this network, this is a concern. And it sort of runs essentially counter to the idea of that everybody participates and that it is entirely decentralized process. There is concentration, and with that come potential conflicts of interest.